Leyla Latypova is a journalist covering politics and civic society in Russia's regions and the ethnic republics for the Moscow Times. As an ethnic Tatar hailing from the Republic of Bashkortostan, she is deeply passionate about the advancing and protecting the rights of Russia's non-Slavic indigenous communities and ethnic minorities through her scholarly and journalistic work, as well as public engagements. And of course, this is coming back as a topic because Russia's war continues. Russia's internal genocide of its ethnic communities continues. And there's also a withdrawal of funding, as we've seen from the shutting down of Voice of America, Liberty Radio, etc., and other networks. We are going to be examining today what impact this may have on those Russian indigenous communities trying to preserve their voices amidst Russia's rising repression. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please check you're subscribed so you don't miss any of the fantastic speakers on the channel. And thank you to everybody who has been supporting our efforts, especially the recent campaigns to buy trucks. We've got a new one of those launching trucks for Ukraine to help Ukrainians remain resilient. And of course, many of you will have helped me out on the forthcoming trip to Ukraine, where we will actually be tagging along with an aid convoy and filming a video diary on the way. Your support for that is massively, massively appreciated. Layla, welcome back to the channel.
Thank you so much for having me again.
Oh, it's an absolute delight, and this is a topic that I feel I really need to educate myself on because I would say, relatively ignorant. But it's not a topic that really makes it much into the mainstream media, and many people do not even really understand the multicultural nature of the Russian empire, as it were, an empire that has carried on when many others have ceased to exist. But today we're going to be looking at this particular topic of the shutdown of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, etc. And again, not everyone will think, okay, well, these had a role in the Cold War and they were very influential then, but why on earth do we need them now? Let's just start with the current activities of those outlets in particular and how they relate to indigenous communities in Russia that already have little enough voice or outlet for journalism, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, to begin with, it's important to kind of have a layout of what Russia's internal, per se, journalistic landscape looks like. And unfortunately, as everything in that country, it's very much skewed towards Moscow. So, and I'm talking about independent media, of course, and all of those outlets that I guess Western listeners from outside of Russia would be familiar with, like TV Rain, Medusa, well, in fact, the Moscow Times that I work with, they all originated in Moscow or anywhere in Central Russia, and they all very much have that, Moscow-centric perspective. There has been some improvement over the past few years. There were a few kind of outlets that popped up that cover regions, but in fact, all of them, again, I will have to highlight ethnicity here, they're all led by ethnic Russians and they all originated in kind of Russian regions. So what we have on the ground in ethnic republics, and there's 21 ethnic republics in Russia, there are 180 ethnicities. What we have over there is indigenous people basically every day facing a choice. They can see something about them, and about their region. But it will be essentially propaganda because most of the news that cover Russia's regions, they are financed by the Kremlin, and especially news in indigenous languages. So it's also mostly state-run channels and state-run newspapers. When we talk about independent journalism, people most likely will have to, rely on, I don't know, Medusa, TV Rain, you name it. And It's a very interesting experience, reading those news outlets, especially while living in one of those ethnic republics, because you might get a sense that you essentially do not exist, because they rarely cover issues in ethnic republics. But also when they do, it's of course done by Russian journalism. So, we do see a lot of exoticization. We also see blatant ethnic slurs, in fact, that make it into the coverage and they're completely normalized. And when it comes, to independent journalists that did exist or still operate in Russia's ethnic republics, even in better times, they always struggled with financing these news outlets, and kind of staying afloat. And of course, an array of repressive laws that Russia introduced made their work pretty much impossible. To give you an example, just on Friday, we've learned that in the Republic of Sakha-Yakutia, so that's Russia's largest republic and largest country subdivision on Earth, a diamond-rich place. An indigenous journalist, Sasha Alexandrova, was arrested, and she's actually accused of terrorism for her work. And she's one of the few remaining independent journalists in that republic. So this is kind of, the landscape that we deal with, and a lot of this kind of news writing was really carried out by, civil society, not professional journalists. It would be like blogs run by just local enthusiasts who would deliver news. And that's where Radio Liberty comes in. I know that, and you've mentioned that some people were saying that it's quite outdated, kind of Cold War era invention. Some even call it a propaganda. Well, in Russia's regions, Radio Free Europe was really doing a very important work that in no way is enough to fill this enormous gap in reporting, but they did a very fair share, of it. So Radio Free Europe had several subdivisions covering various kind of clusters of Russia's ethnic republics and regions. And they did a pretty great job. There is a criticism. We can discuss it later again, from indigenous perspective. But Radio Free Europe was very important, was a very vital source of news for many people. And especially their services in two indigenous languages. So they have a Chechen language service, and then they have a Tatar Bashkir service that was launched in the 1950s. And it's a very unique publication because there is literally no other independent news outlet that reports in the Tatar and Bashkir language. And Tatars and Bashkirs are some of the largest minorities in Russia. So Tatars are around 10 million worldwide. So basically, if Radio Free Europe is gone, there will be no source of news for Tatar speakers, to read in their native language, only the state propaganda, and that's it.
And interestingly, in your article, you state that, of course, there are some outlets in native languages. They are run by the Kremlin, and perhaps a few years ago, you could see a range of social issues discussed, some which might not be, deemed as politically that sensitive. So things like, social policy, town planning, various issues. Almost everything, it seems, from your commentary, is now coming into that remit of politically sensitive. So even things where you could have had some nominal debate about, the details of how people live their lives, there now seems to be, yes, an imposition from the centre, but also a fear, almost a self-generated fear from the regions about what they can and can't cover. So what is the true state of censorship and indeed this self-censorship that you mention?
Yeah, I think, self-censorship is prevalent, but I mean, people have a reason to fear. Of course, we've seen scores of Russian journalists being arrested, and in the regions, I think what really triggered this kind of like next level of censorship across Russia's republics in particular were the protests in Bashkortostan's Baimak that happened in January last year. Those were the largest protests Russia has seen since the start of the war. between 5 and 10,000 people came out to basically oppose the arrest of a very prominent indigenous activist. And, these protests were not concerned with the war in Ukraine, so they didn't really fall under Russia's, newly installed censorship laws. And nevertheless, they triggered one of the largest political trials Russia has ever seen. There are at least 80 people arrested. There are hundreds more that face administrative punishment. So, the entire country saw this unfold and they realized that no, political at this point is not only when it has to deal with Kremlin directly, So I think that forced many more people to be even more conscious because at the heart of those protests, there were ecological issues, in fact, because this campaigner, Fail Alsynov, who was imprisoned, he protested illegal gold mining, which I guess before everyone in Russia could agree that, no, those things are bad. We should stop, kind of all of these oligarchs, coming and taking a piece of land. And Putin's government really liked to exploit that sentiment against oligarchs often to their own advantage. Sometimes, as it was in Bashkortostan before, Putin would even come out in support of those little protests, and kind of play the good guy. I mean, of course, we know that that's completely fake, but there was this kind of game and theater still going on. And I guess events in Baimak in Bashkortostan last year, they have shown everyone that no, this is over. Whatever you touch upon will be and is political. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Just the amount of issues that people can write about, the topics, it has shrunk. There is nothing, especially in local news that receives some government funding, about any pressing issues. There is nothing about, I don't know, for example, again in Bashkortostan, there was this big kind of recent effort to stop an illegal landfill in the second largest town in the Republic. And it was a huge deal. The entire town, like tens of thousands of people came together, they signed petitions, etc. So very much political action. But it wasn't covered by any, kind of state-run news outlets, even though later even Russia's prosecutor general reacted, they in fact like deemed it illegal and they stopped the effort of building a landfill. But everyone chose to stay silent just in case, Kremlin does not agree with this protest action. So yeah, that's where we are.
And someone who's a sort of friend of this channel has been on a couple of times, Ksenia Turkova, is another journalist who has been laid off in this process. And in your article, she was quoted as saying that it is an entirely misguided move. Well, we can dive into some of the details in a minute because we will talk about perhaps the failure of Voice of America, etc., to innovate and experiment more after the end of the Cold War. And maybe it wasn't perfect actually at covering some of the detail, local issues on the ground. But we'll come to some of the sort of failings and how it could and should have reformed. But let's talk about the sort of big picture here. Because Ksenia has said that this is a misguided move to shut these networks down, and ultimately the only beneficiary is the Kremlin. And that one of these so-called metrics, I don't really believe there are any metrics used in the decision made, but one of the metrics that the Voice of America, etc., is judged upon is its success in, ethnic Russian broadcasting, its success in that sort of, the largest bracket of its activity. And it completely ignores this huge diversity of material that is created across, multiple ethnic languages and regions.
I would want to say that I am surprised that Russia's ethnic republics and indigenous people were not taken into account, but I'm not surprised in the slightest. That's unfortunately the reality we live in. And Kremlin has worked for centuries, literally, to, physically exterminate indigenous people living in Russia, but also to erase them from this kind of mental map of anyone who lives in and outside of the country, so of the world, and I think unfortunately it largely succeeded. So I am rather surprised, that Radio Free Europe's regional services have endured, and have remained intact for so long. And especially, the Tatar language service, because the language is dying out very, very quickly, as all Russia's indigenous languages. The numbers of speakers are rapidly declining. And the reason is, of course, deliberate Russification policies on behalf of the Kremlin, no instruction in indigenous languages, etc. So I can't imagine, I don't know the numbers, but probably the Tatar language doesn't have this massive, their language service of Radio Free Europe doesn't have this massive, viewership numbers, but just its very existence is vital for preserving the language. Because if you are someone who wants to learn Tatar, you need materials, you need something to read. And Radio Free Europe's reporting is the only source that basically can be available to you. Yeah, so it's a detrimental move for indigenous journalism, but that is already, in shambles. Yeah, absolutely. And then, I think as and Ksenia, in my article, she mentions that Voice of America might not have been popular in Russia, but it served as a very important counter-propaganda tool to RT elsewhere. And it's same, in Russian regions, because when you a native speaker of Tatar, that's your first language, and it's mostly people living in rural areas. Before you could read, Radio Free Europe, now you will just watch state TV because there is nothing else.
That's it. You won't watch nothing. You'll have to turn to whatever you've got. And let's before we sort of go into some of the sort of weaknesses and issues and how it could have been reformed. I'm fascinated by this idea that actually. Fascinated and terrified actually by the idea that an entire language is actually being put at threat of these sort of materials not being available. So what's the state of the Tatar language in terms of, number of people externally? In the sort of diaspora who would speak it as a first language, how many, on the territory of Russia, and what is the state of fragility? Because we saw a sort of similar attempt in Belarus to put Russia as the main language of all education, commerce, business, administration, etc., and relegate the Belarusian language into a sort of peasant-like language, which you can maybe find vestiges of it in villages, but unfortunately a fairly sort of conscious process to wipe a language out. What's the state of the Tatar language?
Yeah, it's dire. And, we will use, I guess, Tatar as benchmark. And I will remind again that, there are 180 nationalities living in Russia. All of these groups have their own indigenous languages, but Tatars are the largest non-Russian ethnic group. That worldwide numbers at around 10 million, because there's also very big diasporas, particularly, in Poland, in Sweden and Finland. So, just let's use it as a benchmark of a language that is relatively quite well off. And yet, it's nearing, becoming an endangered language. Because if I'm not mistaken, between Russia's two latest censuses, I think the number of speakers nearly halved, so half less. And the reason, of course, is there are very few domains where you can use your indigenous languages. Similarly to Belarus, you mostly are limited to using it at home with your own family. And as you know, any linguist would say that, shrinks your vocabulary because there's just a number of topics that you would be, discussing on a daily basis with your immediate family. So Kremlin essentially, banned education in native languages in 2017. So that was Putin's, personal demand. First, mandatory study of indigenous languages in the republics. It was scrapped before, so I'm an ethnic Tatar, but I grew up in Bashkortostan, so I studied Bashkir language as the official state language at school. So that no longer is in existence. And that particularly accommodates an ethnic Russian population, most of whom, refuse to study indigenous languages. So now they don't have to do it. And but that also, threatens indigenous kids because, of course, what followed after is for any indigenous kids who want to study, their indigenous language on the next level, learn formal grammar, learn how to write, how to read. But a lot of parents are illiterate. They cannot do that. They don't have that level of literally indigenous language that is required, to keep it alive. Those kids cannot also study it at school anymore because, there is no financing, but there are also the provisions in the law are very vague. So schools usually do not want to kind of go against this Russification policy and accommodate indigenous children. So that is the thing in Tatarstan. Also there is a very strong argument that a lot of, parents and educators make, saying that universities in Russia teach exclusively in Russian. You have to take your state exams to enter a university in the Russian language. Why would you devote so much time and study your indigenous language or study in indigenous language, which, they argue it makes you unable to take the state exam in Russian later, because you supposedly don't know the terms enough, etc. So we kind of, the language, the indigenous languages, and Tatar included, they have been boxed into this kind of home domain. And yeah, it's limited. And when you don't have a place to practice it, to use it, language will die out inevitably. And that's where we are. And Radio Free Europe did fascinating things. They have an amazing project for learning Tatar and Bashkir language. It's interactive, it's online, it has podcasts. And I particularly want to highlight that Alsu Kurmasheva, an American Tatar journalist who was released in the prisoner swap, a lot of that is her, her baby, her life's work. She dedicated a lot of time to make, Tatar cool and usable, to, record podcasts, translate certain literature into Tatar and make it interactive. And Del Reali and the Tatar Bashkir service, they also, offer YouTube videos, which is, a lot of fun, and that's how people are likely to engage with Tatar language. So yeah, once that's gone, that's it. You will use it, you will use Tatar language at home to ask mom, cook your favorite dish, but that will be about it. Once you walk out of the house, it's Russian.
And this is the terrifying aspect as well, because we know that Russian imperial propaganda is very active when it comes to trying to erase history and rewrite history. And on this podcast, we've looked at that process in relation to Ukraine, especially. And of course, it pertains to Crimea as well. We've done episodes on Crimea. You come in, you pretend that cities, are founded from the year dot, as it were, when the Russians appear, and you pretend that there was nothing there before. One of the more terrifying aspects of this change in Radio Free Europe, etc., is that there's this 70-year history. Now, you mentioned some modern materials, which of course would be a tremendous loss, but there are also historical archives of journalism, history, studied of various communities. What do we know about this? Are these going to be preserved, or is there a real risk that all this information not just goes online, but gets erased, deleted?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a real threat, with the trajectory that Elon Musk is, how does he call it, optimizing the government, So I think there is a risk that it will all just be gone because, as far as I know, not all of the materials have been digitalized. So the digital archive of particularly, the Tatar language service is quite scarce because those were broadcast. They functioned as a radio during the Cold War. So the only free Tatar language radio that broadcasted from Washington. So yeah, as you said, that will be gone. And the history, some say it's written by victors. I truly believe it's written by journalists who report in real time. Yes, and it will just be, again, the Kremlin narrative because no other sources would exist, if that archive is wiped out. And this would not be the first time when Russia triumphed, in propagating its narrative. And I've noticed that a lot in my research work, even with the existence of Radio Free Europe, events that happened in recent history, like protests in Ingushetia in 2016, for example. The amount of reporting is so scarce that I'm afraid, if 2, 3 news outlets that reported on it get shut down, that's it. You will only hear the Kremlin's version about these protests. So yeah, it is a real threat.
And many of the journalists involved, of course, are on the Kremlin's, how should I say it, various lists, persecution lists, including Inagent and working for Niželetní organizace, etc. But there are various designations and various threats to journalists. What is the prospect? I mean, no one who's worked for these outlets can return to Russia. I'm presuming that that's not possible, whether they're indigenous or ethnic Russian or Poles or whoever. I mean, none of them can actually work in Russia again, is my assumption here. But what is the prospect? Because their work and their expertise is rooted in a particular language, a particular area. For many, this isn't really transferable to go and just, find a job somewhere else, is it?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. Radio Free Europe in particular is dubbed as undesirable organization. And basically, any involvement in the work of undesirable organization is a criminal offense. It's punishable by imprisonment. So of course, those journalists, they cannot just cross the border with Russia, and go back to their normal lives. So even if they want to switch sides, which I presume they wouldn't, but, and work for an outlet that works per se in a Tatar language in Tatarstan, they cannot. Of course, they will be imprisoned immediately. And you're right, those skills, unfortunately, in the state of regional and indigenous journalism as it is today, they are not transferable. And maybe I'll get ahead of our conversation a bit, but the major problem is funding. Several months ago, I jump-started this initiative called From the Republics, and that's basically the first indigenous-led English and Russian language news outlet. And that's kind of my way, of bringing my, enormous amount of skills, in reporting that I've gained in English language journalism with the Moscow Times back to the people that need it most. And I think those are people in Russia's ethnic republics. But this is a completely volunteer initiative that a few volunteers are helping me out with. And one of the major reasons why is very severe lack of funding for any indigenous-led initiatives. So, I would be happy to, also expand and kind of lead perhaps reporting in Tatar language, and if Radio Free Europe closes, make this a hub, for any indigenous journalist, but journalists need to get paid. And I think especially indigenous journalists, because indigenous knowledge is precious and it's either stolen, or often taken for free from people. But even before, closure of USAID, there has always been a very severe disparity in how funds are delivered. And I'm just talking about the Russian context right now. So, of course, Russian-led initiatives that have established themselves long time ago out of Moscow, they have always been a priority for donors. And I've heard that, in multiple meetings I've attended with other indigenous activists and, very big players in donor community that I'm not going to name, people will blatantly tell you, well, if you want to be financed, partner with a Russian initiative, and then we will talk, because they're doing serious business. Um, yeah, there is a lot of, blatant racism, and there is always a question from donors, well, if you think you're so good, why haven't you gotten funding until now? And you try to talk about systemic racism, and how it impacts you. But there is often, this wall of complete misunderstanding. So yeah, basically, if we lived in a more equal playing field, I think there would be a place where, other indigenous language outlets could thrive. But unfortunately, it brings us back to just very systemic issues that exist, in journalism today.
And these services, of course, were tremendously popular during the Cold War period, in particular 50s and 60s. I don't think there are exact listening figures, but regularly between 20 and 30 million people across the USSR would sort of tune in and listen. For many, this was a lifeline. Perhaps of sanity of the decades trapped within the Soviet Union. Did listeners at that point make much of a distinction between, let's say, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and indeed the BBC as well? Because we also see huge cutbacks coming to the BBC World Service, and we see US aid being dropped as well. So, in terms of the sort of big picture, how do audiences sort of view all these? In comparison to, say, the sort of Soviet period when they're at their peak? And is this a wider issue that goes far beyond VOA and RFE?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely correct. In the Soviet period, it was all one, and I can attest, in my family, the coverage provided by Radio Free Europe and Voice of America was vital. Absolutely, my parents were very avid listeners, and in fact, I think back then also the listenership was much higher in republics within Russia and other Soviet republics, just because it was the signal was clearer, so people could, as opposed to Moscow, they had a much better, much easier access to all of these broadcasts. So, and I want to highlight for this entire generation, particularly, people born in 50s and 60s, uh, this is like a huge, part of their life, listening to Voice of America, listening to BBC, and of course, particularly, to the music broadcast, because I think that was the favorite. That was the first time people heard Beatles, or Led Zeppelin, etc. So of course that has changed. You have all the streaming platforms in Russia, so you no longer, and you can buy vinyl, CDs, whatever, and your collector's editions. So these broadcasters no longer play that role of, kind of the only window into the West. But I think, they still bring very high quality reporting that is, of course, needed. There's simply not enough of it. You can, say that, oh, there are a lot of independent news outlets in Russia, but it's just never enough. Good reporting is precious. Um, yeah, and I think especially, as we said, in the regional context, it will be a huge loss. As for the BBC, BBC does not have this reach into Russian regions as Radio Free Europe, for example, did, but they still do an amazing coverage of Russia. And what I think is important is that um, these Western-made broadcasters, they also bring in very high quality, very high standards of English language journalism. And I think we always forget that School of Independent Russian Journalism is very young. There was none of it in the Soviet Union. So it's only since the Soviet collapse that these traditions were building. And we still see, a lot of very quirky, approaches to reporting that, for example, editorial rooms taking, stances on certain issues, which, in Western journalism, yes, you can, in US, there is a tradition of backing, for example, a certain candidate for elections, etc. But beyond that, neutrality and asking all parties involved is kind of the baseline. And we see that not all Russian outlets do that. So I think that's also a very, very important part of what BBC and Radio Free Europe and Voice of America did is really, having a certain standard, certain thresholds that they always adhere to. And that's important.
We'll get on to the weaknesses perhaps that made it sort of more difficult to stand up for radio for Europe, etc. Although that probably wouldn't have done anything against Musk and his team of wreckers in any case. But I did an episode a while back looking at the new sort of propagandistic journalist schools. And this is one of the challenges, isn't it? Because whereas many of the indigenous republics actually produce most of the mineral wealth of Russia, if people like yourself, sort of brought up in the indigenous republics, if you want to get on now, you have to plug yourself into the propagandistic machine. You have to learn those methods. And typically, you would learn those methods in Moscow, for instance, and you'd have to work on, I would say, the ethnic Russian propaganda empire, if you want a good material life and the sort of status that comes with that. Is this one of the challenges that is facing, anybody in ethnic republics who is looking for a path into journalism? And now you have Radio for Europe and others gone. There's very few external paths to develop such a career.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we have to start with how Moscow-centric education system is. So, per se, even when a more sort of independent Russian universities existed, like the Higher School of Economics back in its glory days, when it was still cooperating with Western institutions, there were exchange programs, etc. It was still based in Moscow. So if you study journalism there, it will be Russian journalists who teach you, how to cover certain things. And this means that there is no tradition, for example, of indigenous perspectives in journalism. And it's fascinating. Indigenous people are often, don't have any say in editorial processes. And even, when I write myself, sometimes I doubt, am I being biased in my perspective? Because, it differs from my Russian colleagues because, I'm an indigenous woman and this is the way, we see it from indigenous perspective. So, that school has been completely absent. So it has always been learning from Russian journalists and learning from journalists hailing from Moscow. So it's fascinating when you read, a lot of coverage of Russian regions in Russian, it's always kind of this Moscow view of what's happening in this, as they would call it, a remote and exotic place. So for indigenous journalists, there was always this choice, right? I mean, if you want to go into profession, you have to comply with these rules because chances are you find funding to create your own newsroom and push your own perspective are very limited. And now, it's propaganda only, and I think it's in fact often, an absurd situation. I am not going to name names in this podcast, even though I do think those people need to be named and shamed. But I have a former classmate of mine who went into, kind of a propaganda role in Bashkortostan. And it's very funny because things, and he's an ethnic Bashkort, so he's an indigenous, of indigenous population in Bashkortostan. And he, on camera praises the Russian world, etc. And it's absolutely absurd, looking at him and hearing him praise the almighty, glorious Russia. And I see him, traveling to the occupied Ukrainian territories and having Russian nationalist flags behind him and saying, how he's with Russia till the end. While, Russia is exterminating his own, people of his own kin. And, blatant racism is everywhere. And, he's an Asian looking guy, in Russia, he's not exactly the part of this Russian world. So it's absolutely absurd. I mean, probably, his motivation is, he definitely probably wanted to be a journalist, wanted to be a star, and that's the career he's building. But I think seeing Indigenous people in those roles, it's absurd, but also it's absolutely tragic. It's a great tragedy of just the tokens that these people have become.
It is, and the amount of values one has to surrender to do that. But then we see people making those choices all over. It's not confined to Russia. Again, naming no names, but there are plenty of examples coming out of the US these days as well. Unfortunately, it's something of an export and growing. In the last segment, let's turn let's turn to some of the, let's say, sort of structural weaknesses perhaps in Voice of America and so on, because of course much criticism has been leveled at it, including that, it never managed to adapt following the Cold War. It didn't manage to adapt to reflect, a sort of a younger, more attractive, more sort of energetic kind of output, or evolve its formats. And then also, let's come to this criticism has also been leveled at it, that it may have been relatively good at some of the larger ethnicities, but really sort of struggled when it came to looking at sort of, real local issues. And I guess that's always going to be a problem with resources and so on, and expertise. But what are the main criticisms you think that stand up, that it failed to adapt? And then lastly, we'll come on to, why that doesn't necessarily mean it should be shut down, how it could potentially have adapted rather than, the drastic action we've seen.
Yeah, absolutely. In my article, one of my sources who used to work for Radio Free Europe's Caucasus services, they particularly highlighted that, and that was an Indigenous person I spoke with. And they basically highlighted that all of this coverage of the Caucasus in particular was directed by Russians, and some of it came, the direction came from the Moscow based, the kind of division of Radio Free Europe. So this again, going back to the issue of how much say do Indigenous people have and how they're being covered and how their communities are being represented. That criticism, unfortunately, we can extend to Radio Free Europe, at least to the Caucasus services, to my knowledge. I mean, of course, there is the Tatar service where it's Indigenous people, Indigenous speakers, who direct the coverage, etc. But I also understand, that Radio Free Europe is a large corporation, and being that comes with limitations. Of course, there is certain standard of how you can do reporting, what you do and what you do not do. And there is less flexibility, as if per se it's a smaller regional outlet run by a small team, that can quickly, adapt and use different formats of delivering information, etc., and etc. Still, despite that criticism, I think Radio Free Europe, they were great at their job, especially with the Volga-Ural region. They were very quick with providing information, and I think they adapted quite well to, the demands. They have like a glowing Telegram channel, etc. Yeah, and I really, just don't think that any of those criticisms is enough to say we do not need Radio Free Europe in Russia anymore. Yes, maybe in some ways they cannot compete, with this kind of younger generation of eager Indigenous journalists, but also Indigenous activists who also have to go into producing news content because there are very few news outlets in their regions. But as one journalist told me in my series of interviews with former, and current Radio Free Europe employees, they said, you know, nothing, let me rephrase that. They said competition is not an issue when it comes to regional reporting, and that's absolutely true. Competition is so small that it doesn't matter. And even right now, with Radio Free Europe in existence and some other regional news outlets, that's not nearly enough. There are so many republics, so many corners of Russia, so many indigenous communities that get no coverage. And that is a problem of resourcing, first and foremost. So yeah, and with Radio Free Europe gone, I honestly do not know who can even feel that, big, big, big void. Um,
And reform, it's been said, and Ksenia sort of comments on this as well, that actually, and one could say this for a lot of the departments that are coming under fire in the US. As I say, it seems to be a wrecking ball approach rather than, looking to salvage or reform or build anything in the place of what's being destroyed. But what what would a reformed, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, etc., in your view, look like to help them meet the sort of changing demands? And let's face it, Russia is in a revanchist phase. It's in a neo-imperialistic phase, which not only involves external aggression, but it involves a heightened repression and aggression internally as well against minorities.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, again, as an Indigenous woman, I think the best reform would be decentralization of the services and just giving more say to Indigenous people and covering their own regions. And I think that is clearly something that Kremlin is very scared of. They really don't want to give any agency to Indigenous people. And I think educating a new generation, or even one of the first, generations in cases of some republics of independent indigenous journalists, that's an enormous amount, of anti-Kremlin power that you kind of inject into this world. Um, so I think that would be an amazing reform. Yet, we know that current US administration is very much against diversity and inclusion policies. So that definitely won't be on their agenda. But I think that would be one way of bringing new readership to Radio Free Europe. But also, yeah, just bringing out new perspectives into the world, and even going as far as not being afraid to reform standards of Russian language journalism. There are certain namings, for example, and spellings, as we've seen, in fact, with Ukraine, as the way Kiev has been spelled according to Russian spelling by many, many, many foreign news outlets for years, until the full-scale invasion, when suddenly, newsrooms awoken and they were like, oh, probably that was wrong. We shouldn't have translated that from Russian. And I mean, that's true for, all the indigenous names and names of the republics as well. They're just spelled according to Russian spelling, whatever it is, in English and also in Russian, a lot of those are colonial names that Russians use instead of, using indigenous names for certain places. So, even making a statement like that, I think that would be very attractive to leadership. And that's one way of reforming, not only Radio Free Europe, but this entire, journalism field in Russia that has been very Russian dominated and unfortunately hasn't gotten rid of a lot of imperial narratives.
And on balance, this is a fairly, I would say, pessimistic conversation. But do you hold out any optimism that there may be some change, or there may be new services emerging from the rubble of the old ones, or indeed, people like yourself with the sort of, energy and talent to keep those voices being heard, or are you relatively pessimistic at this point?
Um, I see that I go through phases, as I guess all of us, there is absolute despair, but then there is also optimism in the sense that I think it's a sad, but at the same time, very funny thing. If you ask anyone in the Indigenous activist community and Indigenous creators, how, for example, the USAID shutdown has affected them. Well, they will tell you it has not because they never saw any money from any donors in any case. So they've been doing their work voluntarily and they're carrying on. Which is, it's great that we will see more content from them, but it's also tragic to realize, just the disparity that always existed in the donor community when it comes to Indigenous initiatives. So part of me thinks that maybe this shakeup is good. It will inevitably, and I hope, force some other prospective donors, some other altruists to step up, to step in, and perhaps they will be bolder in their decisions. Perhaps, they will choose to support young, energetic Indigenous initiatives, because we know that in donor community, a lot of established organizations, they like to support, kind of bigger players. And when it comes to Russian context, unfortunately, it's all Moscow originated journalist, activist groups, etc., you name it. So, maybe it is a turn for the best just because this is going to be a great shakeup and it might in some way level the playing field for us, for Indigenous people. Perhaps I'm too optimistic, but I want to believe that inevitably, things will change, and maybe through this adversity, we will find something, some light, and things will actually change for the better.
It's a rare episode where we end on something optimistic, but that's probably that is a good place to end, and a sort of call to action to people who want to assist, people who want to do something about this and learn more about it. I think a great starting point is the sort of journalistic output that you're able to still produce under the banner of the Moscow Times. And indeed, that's a great place to start and explore other voices of Indigenous writers, speakers, journalists, etc., as well as cultural figures. Leyla, for today, thank you so much for coming back on the channel.
Thank you so much for inviting me.